Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Mem. We begin the fifth perek with the Mishnah. Hayu bodkin otan b'sheva chakirot. The Bet Din would examine the witnesses by asking them 7 basic fundamental questions. These are called chakirot, and this is about simply where and when did this incident happen. You have to ask these questions, and they have to get them all right, meaning they have to match up with each other. The language of the Mishnah is a little bit confusing because bidikot are the other questions. That's the added set of questions to say what was in the background, what color shirt were they wearing, and so on. It uses the verb here, bodkin, to refer to chakirot, but we're focusing on the noun here, chakirot, even though it uses the verb bodkin. That just means to examine. We're not talking about bidikot. Okay, so we're talking about the chakirot, the fundamental questions, and they are 7. We ask the witnesses. We ask one witness. We bring them both in. We warn them. It's really important not to lie, especially in a capital case. You can kill a person and all of his descendants and so on. And then we ask one to leave the room, and we examine the older one, and then we bring in the other one. So we're asking them the same questions separately, and they better match up, or else we will kick out their testimony. So the first question we ask is Be'ezo Shavua, during which Shemitah cycle in the Yovel? We don't count Yovel anymore, but back then they counted every 50 years, and so within that 50-year cycle, or 49 years, there would be the first Shemitah, the second Shemitah, the third, so that there would be 7 Shemitahs within a 49 or 50-year cycle. So you have to know which Shemitah it's in. Be'ezo Shana, within the Shemitah, which of the 7 years is it? Is it the first year after the Shemitah, second, third of the Shemitah cycle? Be'ezo Chodesh, within that year, what month was it? Bechama b'Chodesh, what date during the month? First Rosh Chodesh, second, third day. Be'eze Yom, Be'eze Sha'ah, what day of the week was it? Tuesday, Wednesday? What time was it? Be'eze Makom, and where did it happen? So actually, there's a lot about the time and only one about the place. These are necessary because it makes their testimony falsifiable through hazama. Because they said, we were in this place at this exact time, that would allow the possibility that someone else can come and they hear this testimony and say, wait a second, these 2 witnesses, did they testify that they were in New York seeing a murder on that date and that time? Not true. We know that day, that time, I have the ticket stub. They were in a baseball game in Chicago, so they couldn't have seen it. If the witnesses don't say the date and time, then you wouldn't be able to have edim mizimim come and say, no, it wasn't at that time. So these are absolutely necessary, because by making it possible to falsify, that way, that will add to the truth if no one comes around and says that the witnesses were anywhere else. Rabbi Yosef Omer, be'eze yom, be'eze shah, be'eze makom. Rabbi Yosef says, you don't need all of the questions, only need 3 of them. Which day, what hour, and where. So you don't need to ask which Shemitah was it, what year in the Shemitah, just ask the day. So this is interesting because there's some discussion. What if the witnesses come and say, it happened today, this morning? Do they still have to go through the whole process and say, it was in this, during this Yovel, during this Shemitah, and all that? So that's a discussion. It could be, yes, according to Tanakama, this is part of the protocol. You have to do all of these things. I mean, once you say the day of the week it is, once you say what day of the month it is, it's the 3rd of Elul, so then won't you know, you can figure out what day of the week it is also. But maybe this protocol is important because when someone's lying, they want to lie as little as possible. And they just say, oh, it happened last Tuesday, or whatever. But by being so specific and adding all the details, so then that might make a person more reluctant to lie. Also, it'll publicize the matter. If you just say it was on 3rd of Elul, and then someone else hearing that might not remember that was Tuesday. But if you say it was also Tuesday, then they'll say, oh wait, Tuesday, you were with us in the ball game. We always go on Tuesday. And so that will give more information to other people if there are edim mizimim out there. Okay, so Tanakama says 7, and the Gemara will ask, how do you know that you need all these 7? And the Bioseh says you only need 3 questions. Makirim atem oto hitretem bo ha'obed avodah zara et mi avad uba me avad. Now, besides the 7 or 3, which are the chakirot, now there are additional questions, and these might already be in the realm of bidikot. There's some discussion about, are these fundamental questions or are these added questions? Anyway, we ask them, do you recognize him? Him, it's not clear who this is referring to. Is it the victim, Rashi says, or is it the perpetrator? The context seems to, over here, seems to say the perpetrator. Right? Do you recognize him? Is this the guy that, he's sitting here in court? Do you recognize him? Is he the one that committed the murder? Did you warn him beforehand? You don't give someone capital punishment in most cases unless you warn them before and tell them, don't you know that cooking on Shabbat that you're about to do is a violation of Shabbat, and the punishment is sikila, and the person has to answer, yes, I know, and still I am going to do it. If you don't give a warning, then, well, maybe they didn't know. Maybe they didn't know it was a Shabbat. Maybe they didn't know that this was prohibited. Or maybe they knew it was prohibited, but they thought that it's not capital punishment. They thought that's just a fine. And so you have to make sure that the witnesses actually warned him about that. If it was avodah zara, mi avad uba me avad. If the sin was idolatry, then you have to ask the witnesses, what God did this person, the defendant, worship, and how did he worship him? Did he worship this God by making a sacrifice, by bowing down? You have to describe the act itself, whatever it was, and if it would be a murder or whatever other act it was, they would have to give some description of what happened. And anyone, when the court adds more bidikot, more of these extra questions, the better. The more, the better. In this case, actually, asking more questions is more lenient on the defendant, because the more questions you ask the witness, the more chance there is that they will say something that is wrong. And once they say something contradictory to each other, then you throw out the testimony, and then the defendant goes free. So that's why the Mishnah is saying, add more. Make sure that they're not lying. If you ask only the basic questions, then they could be lying. They could coordinate and give the same answers to these. But if you ask lots of detailed questions, then you're more likely to find if they're lying. And there was an incident where Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, this must have been an old story when he was just called Ben Zakkai, and he asked the witnesses about the stems of the figs. There was a certain incident that happened near a fig tree. And so he asked the witnesses, listen, this fig tree, right? You said this crime happened under a fig tree. Well, I want to ask you, these figs on the tree, what was the shape of its stalks, of the stems, right? Was it fat like this or skinny? Was it long or was it short? And so they had to remember that specific. And then one of them would say they were fat, and the other would say they were skinny. So, see, you guys are lying. And this is something very difficult to pay attention to or remember. And so you see that Ben Zakkai fulfilled this statement that one should ask many, many questions. Ma ben hakirot lebedikot. Now, what is the consequence of the difference between the basic questions and the added questions? Regarding the basic 7 questions, if any of the witnesses says, I don't know, then we discount the testimony. Right? Where did this happen? I don't know. I don't remember where it was. It was on one of these streets over here. No, you have to know exactly where it was. Otherwise, we throw out the testimony. Whereas when it comes to bidikot, the extra questions, if one of them says, I don't know, or even if both of them say, I don't know, then that's okay. Their testimony is fine. So if they say, fig tree, I don't remember what the stems of the figs looked like, that's okay. We'll still accept their testimony. As long as they don't answer it and contradict each other. If they say, yes, I know, it was long. It says, yes, I know, they were short. well then that's no good. But if they say, I don't know, that's okay for the extra questions. So what they have in common is that both the fundamental questions and the added questions, if they contradict each other, then the testimony is void. But the Hakirot, they have to answer. Bedikot, they can say pass. אחד אומר בשניים בחודש, ואחד אומר בשלושה בחודש, עדותן קיימת, שזה יודע בעיבורו של חודש, וזה אינו יודע בעיבורו של חודש. If the witnesses are off by a day, when they say the date during the month, that's okay. If one of them says it's the second day of the month and one says it's the third day of the month, then we allow the testimony to continue because one of them knows that the previous month was a pregnant month, it was a 30-day month, and therefore that would be a 2-day Rosh Chodesh, and so the Rosh Chodesh started a day later. So he said today is the second day of the month, whereas the other one thought that the previous month was not me'ubad, it was only 29 days, so he started counting Rosh Chodesh, one day Rosh Chodesh only, and he's already on the third day of the month. So they didn't have a fixed calendar. Everything is being decided month by witnesses, or they have some kind of fixed calendar, but whatever. He didn't know what the exact day. So it's possible that someone gets the day wrong, especially if it was based on witnesses and the word didn't get out yet which day was Rosh Chodesh. So that's understandable. If they contradict each other, it could be that they're really referring to the same day. So that's okay. But if one says today's the third day of the month, and the other says today's the fifth day of the month, there's no way to explain that error. That means one of them is just totally wrong, and that suggests that they're liars, and therefore we throw out the testimony. If one of them says that this incident happened in the second hour of the day, and the other says the third hour of the day, that's okay, because one can be off by an hour. They didn't, when they say an hour of the day, let's say from sunrise till, let's say sunrise is at 6 to 7, they call that whole hour the first hour of the day. So they're not using like 7 o'clock as a point, but rather the first hour, the second hour. So if they're off by an hour, so it could be that it happened towards the end of the second hour or towards the beginning of the third hour. So even just a few minute difference, you can say, well, I think it was the second hour or the third hour, and so that's not off by much. So that's okay. If one says it was the third hour and the other one says it was the fifth hour, so there's a whole fourth hour in between. So then they're off by more than 60 minutes. And so that's too far off, and the testimony is declared invalid. That's Tanakama. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Kayemet. Rabbi Yehuda says even that it's hard. Before watches, how do you know exactly what time it is? You can be off by an hour without a watch, right? Go try walking around without a watch and guessing what time it is, and so you might get confused between the end of the third hour and the beginning of the fifth hour would be possible. If whether it's 11:05 or 9:55. So it's even though it's over an hour difference, but if you don't have a clock, then it would be hard to know exactly what time it was, and one can make such an error. So they're still lying. They're still telling the truth. They could be telling the truth, even though they said third and fifth. However, Rabbi Yehuda says if one of them says that the incident happened in the fifth hour and the other in the seventh hour, then their testimony is invalid because you have noon in between, and the sun switches from the east. On the fifth hour, the sun is towards the east, and once the seventh hour comes, it passed the midpoint and is already going towards the west. So that, even before watches, anybody can tell. You just look up at the sky, and you'll know if it's before noon or after noon. So that's the difference. The difference between the third hour and the fifth hour, those are both in the morning. So the sun is somewhere in the eastern part of the sky. It's hard to tell exactly which part, if it's the third hour or fifth hour. So that's easy for someone to make a mistake, but they're still telling the truth. If someone says fifth and the other says seventh, then for sure they're lying because that's easy to tell which one it is. After we ask the first guy all these questions, we bring in the second guy and we ask him the same questions. If their words are aligned, then we open up the case for examination. And if it's a capital case, this is all talking about a capital case, we examine only for the merit, only for innocence. אמר אחד מן העדים, יש לי ללמד עליו זכות, או אחד מן התלמידים, יש לי ללמד עליו חובה, משתקין אותו. So, if one of the witnesses says, I want to offer an argument for innocence. We discussed already, witnesses cannot offer arguments because the witnesses, even though the witnesses just testified, yeah, we saw him, he did idolatry and deserves capital punishment. Even though the witnesses just said that, could be that the witness doesn't actually want the person to be killed. He came because it's a mitzvah to give testimony, but doesn't actually want the guy to be killed because who wants the blood on his hands and the anger from the family? So the witness is not trusted. He might be he's trusted to testify. He's not trusted to offer arguments because he is not equal-minded. He might be biased towards innocence, even though he's the very witness that gave the proof that he did the crime. So therefore, we don't accept any any arguments from witnesses either way. And now, if one of the students says, "I have an argument for guilt," also we don't accept it because we only want arguments for innocence because the judges want to push it towards that way. So we're not interested in adding more arguments from the students for guilt. So we tell them, be quiet, we're not listening to you. אמר אחד מן התלמידים, יש לי ללמוד עליו זכות, מעלין אותו ומושיבין אותו ביניהם, ולא היה יורד משם כל היום. If one of the students, remember there were 3 rows of 23 students each, and if one of them says, oh, I have a suggestion for why we should find him innocent, then we say, okay, we want to hear it. We invite that student up onto the dais, and he sits with the other judges, and he wouldn't go down the whole day. So this would encourage all the students to try to think of something that they could offer for innocence. And then, with all these students and the judges themselves also thinking of reasons for innocence, so any source or argument or logic towards innocence, hopefully somebody will think of. So this would be a great honor. So he gets called up and he says, okay, now let's hear what you have to say. And if he has some substance, then the court listens to him and takes it into consideration and will discuss it back and forth. But either way, whether they end up accepting that argument or not, that student stays on the dais and participates with the other judges during deliberation, which would be a great incentive for them. And even if the defendant himself says, I have something to say in my defense, a reason for acquittal, we'll listen to him as long as he has some substance. If he says, I know why I should be innocent, and then it's okay, why? And he has nothing to say, he's just blabbering about nonsense, it's okay, so we ignore him. But maybe he knows something, and we will definitely take that into consideration. Remember, there's no lawyers allowed in the Bet Din, so the litigant himself, he can offer arguments in his own defense. Now, if they realize, yep, he has good arguments for innocence, so then they will vote and they will let him go. However, if the vote comes in, a majority says he's guilty, then they don't kill him that day. Rather, they say, we want to sleep on it, we're going to come reconvene tomorrow, and let's see if anybody changes their mind. Now, they don't just go out to eat and go to the movies and forget about it. No, now they have to spend all night thinking about the case. So they would get paired up in pairs to discuss with each other. So this is one of the origins of having a chevruta. When you have a chevruta, so one says this, and you're going to argue back and So there's nothing better than having someone arguing with you. If you think about something just alone by yourself, then it's likely that you'll just keep repeating the same argument and convince yourself. You're not going to be challenged. You need someone else to come and challenge you. So this is very important, that all the judges split up into pairs, breakout groups, and they would not eat a lot. This is not time for sitting and eating and drinking. Eat a little just to get by, but they really want to concentrate. They would not drink wine at all because they want to have their faculties totally clear, and they would continue and discussing it all night. And then on the next day, they would come back. They obviously go to sleep because it says they wake up. So when it says kol halayla, so they would get together in pairs part of the night. Maybe they would then think about it themselves part of the night. They would sleep part of the night, and then they would wake up and come back to Bet Din. HaMezakeh omer ani mezakeh umezakeh ani bimkomi. HaMechayev omer ani mechayev umechayev ani bimkomi. The one who said that he was innocent yesterday, he may come to court and say, I said innocent yesterday, and I remain in my position. And similarly, the one who said he was guilty will say, I said he was guilty yesterday, and after thinking about it, I remain in my position. That could be. Or they might change their mind. Someone who said guilty yesterday can change his mind and say, you know what, I thought about it more, and I now say innocent. That's okay, you can switch that way. However, the one who said innocent is not allowed to change their mind now to say guilt. Once you say innocent, you're stuck in that position, and that would also lead the court much more towards innocence if you can only change in one direction. Remember, Rav understood the Mishnah as teaching that this is only talking about during the deliberation, during the argumentation part when all the judges are discussing. If you argued for innocence, you have to stick with that argument. However, when it comes to voting, you can vote any way you want. That's what Rav said. But if you don't follow Rav, it means once you voted for innocence, then you have to vote the same way for innocence forever. So we're really only waiting for people to change their minds for innocence, but they can't change their minds for guilt at all, not even during the voting, if we don't follow Rav. If one of the judges makes a mistake about what he said yesterday, then the two court stenographers will remind him. One of them comes in and says, oh, yesterday I said guilty for this reason, because I quoted this pasuk and this argument. Court stenographer says, no, you didn't. That's not what you said. You didn't quote that argument. You quoted a different argument. So it's important that they remember which argument that they said, because if they offer a new argument, then they're going to have to sleep on it again. Or if they try to change their position, maybe they misremembered and says, oh, of course, I always said innocent. No, you didn't. You said guilty yesterday. Okay, so we have to remind them, especially if they said innocent yesterday and they come in and say, I said guilty yesterday. No, you didn't. You said innocent. And that would mean they wouldn't be able to change their mind. Okay, so the court stenographers are important because just in case the judges forget some detail about what someone said. Now on the second day, if they now found reason to acquit, then they say, okay, we vote again. And some people changed their minds and voted for innocence, so then he goes free. If not, so it depends on the outcome of the vote. If you have 12 saying he's innocent and 11 saying he's guilty, then obviously he goes free. That's a majority for innocence. If 12 say he's guilty and 11 say he's innocent, that's a simple majority, and you can't win by one when you're talking about capital punishment. We're not going to kill someone based on only one person's decision, and so if it's 12 guilty against 11 innocent, then we're going to not kill him. Instead, we're going to add 2 more judges from the bench to see if they can make it win by 2, or a simple majority for innocence. And now, even if you have 11 that say innocent and 11 that say guilty, and one says, I don't know, once one person abstains, then you only have 22 judges, and that's not a quorum. You need 23 judges. And in fact, even if 22 say innocent or 22 say guilty, and one says, I don't know, I pass, then that you don't have a quorum of 23, because by saying, I don't know, it's like he doesn't exist. And therefore, we have to add 2 more from the bench, and then they'll vote again. So you add 2 more. Now what if you add 2 more, but those 2 are split? And now instead of 12-11, now it's 13-12, and still only winning by 1 for guilt. Well, you still can't kill him. You add 2 more, you keep adding 2 more, until you get to a maximum of 71. There's no bigger court than 71, so you can't add any more than that. Now, what if you added all that, and then you have Sheloshim v'shisha mezakin, Sheloshim v'chamisha mechayabin zakai. After you keep adding, if you end up with 36 who say innocent and 35 who say guilty, that's a simple majority for innocence. He goes free. Sheloshim v'shisha mechayabin, Sheloshim v'chamisha mezakin, danin elu keneged elu ad sheyir'eh echad mina mechayabin divrei mezakin. If the other way around, you have 36 who say guilty and 35 who say innocent. So now we have a simple majority for guilt, which is not enough. And you can't add any more because we're already at the max of 71. So what do? We tell them, keep on arguing, keep on discussing until one of the judges who said guilty will change his mind to innocence. And then once one person changes his mind, you'll have a simple majority for innocence, and then we will let the guy go free. So a simple reading of the Mishnah is that you can only change one way. However, Rav interpreted this Mishnah already because he was asked about it, and he said, no, the Mishnah is giving you an example because hopefully someone will find a reason to acquit so he can go free. But it could go the other way. It could be if you switch one innocence to guilt, then we'll find him guilty, and that'll be by 2, and then he'll get capital punishment. So according to Rav, it could actually go either way. And a simple reading of the Mishnah, it sounds like it can only go one way, and so actually it'll be deadlocked forever. But we're not going to kill him at all, ever. We're just waiting for someone to change their minds so that we can close the case. But we kind of know the result. If you don't follow Rav, then it can only result in innocence. Okay, Minah Nemileh. What is the source of the first halacha in the Mishnah that we ask 7 basic questions of chakirot? Amar Rav Yehuda de'amar kerad v'darashta v'chakarta v'shalta hetev ve'omer v'ugadlecha v'shamata v'darashta hetev ve'omer v'dareshu hashofetim hetev. So we have 3 different Pesukim that are talking about 3 different subjects. One is in Devarim 13, that's talking about a whole city that goes to idolatry, Liyad Hanidachat. And it says, if you hear that there is a city among you that is following Avodah Zarah, then the judges have to go and they have to Darashta, Chakarta, Sha'alta. So 3 different verbs for asking questions: inquire, investigate, ask diligently. Well, the word Sha'alta is kind of weak. So Darashta and Chakarta, those are serious words. The Sha'alta we're putting together with Hetev. Do this very much. So Sha'alta and Hetev together are 1. Anyway, we see 3 words for asking questions when it comes to an idolatrous city. So that we're up to 3. Now we're going to go to the next pasuk in Devarim 17, which is about an individual who worships idols. Individual worship idols, different law than the whole city. If it's a whole city, then we come and bring the army, and all those who are guilty are killed by the sword, by beheading. If it's and not only that, but the whole city, their wealth, all their property gets put in the middle of the square and is all burnt. So that's a very serious thing if it's a whole city. If it's an individual, then the individual, their money doesn't get destroyed, whatever their family will get it, but that person gets sikila, which is interesting because sikila is actually more stringent than beheading. So there's something stringent about the individual who follows idolatry. Anyway, regarding the individual who follows idolatry, the pasuk says, right, if it's told to you and you heard about it, then you should v'darashta. That's one word, and etev we're counting as a second word, as a word of emphasis, so that we count that too. So this individual idolater says two words for asking questions. So now we have 3 words for Iran Idachat, 2 words for an individual idolater. That's 5 altogether. And then the last place that it says words like this is regarding Edim Zomemin. So if there's a case of Edim Zomemin, then V'dareshu Ashofetim Hetev says Dareshu. That's one word of interrogation. And we're talking specifically about a case of capital punishment where the original witnesses said this guy deserves capital punishment because he violated Shabbat or whatever it is. And then they're found to be that they weren't even there. So we give the Edim Zomemin the same capital punishment that they tried to give. And here it says one word, Dareshu, and Hetev we're counting as a second word. And so there you go, that's the last 2, and that makes 7. So that's 3, 2, and 2. Remember all these 3 contexts because we're going to talk about them further. It's the idolatrous city, the individual idolater, and Edim Zomemin, and it's 3, 2, and 2, respectively. All together, that makes 7. That's how we know that we have to ask 7 questions. And then we ask about this methodology. Wait a second. How do you know you're supposed to add them all up? Maybe the Pesukim are telling you that when it comes to Iran Idachat, you ask 3 questions. When it comes to individual idolater, you ask 2 questions, and Edim Zomein, you ask only 2 questions. And maybe that would be sufficient. Each one is telling you its own context. How do you know that you're supposed to add them all up? Because if you wanted to say 7 questions, then it should have said 7 words like this, like asking questions, in one context, and then I would know from that one context I could use as a paradigm and say, just like in this case of capital punishment, I have 7 questions, so too in all other cases of capital punishment, we have to ask the witnesses 7 questions, right? Then I could learn 7 questions for everything. But the way it's written now, maybe it's 3 for this, 2 for this, and 2 for that. And the answer is Kevan de Kulhu Behadeh Ketiba Mehadadeh Yalfeh Vechevan de Yalfeh Mehadadeh Keman Dichti Bechadadameh. So the answer is that since they're all written with similar terminology, so therefore we can learn one from the other. We're going to, like a Gezer HaShavah, we're going to compare one to the other. And since we're connecting each one to the next, it's as if they're all written in one place. So you're right. If it had all 7 in one place, we would learn it that way. But the fact that it uses the same words in various of these 3 contexts, so we can connect them together, and since we're connecting them together, it's the same as if it was all written in one place. And now the Gemara asks, Veha ladamya lahadadeh. How can you just connect all these 3 Pesukim together and then count them all as if there were one, and you have 7 words, that means 7 questions? How can you do that? In fact, they're all talking about different subject matters. It's true, they all involve capital punishment, but each one has a distinctive feature that the other one does not share. And here are the distinctive features. Idolatrous city is not similar to the other 2 because in the other 2, their money is saved. In Iran Idachat, we take all the wealth of the whole place and we burn it in the city center. Whereas you don't do that for an individual idolater or for an Ed Zomem. When we say Ed Zomem, we're assuming it's a capital case. If it was a monetary case, in fact, he would have to pay. But again, we don't destroy all of his wealth. He just has to pay whatever it is that he testified about. And so, Iran Idachat is different from the others. Avodah Zarah lahanach tarteh l'adam yasheken b'saif. And an individual idolater is different from the others because an individual idolater gets stoned. Stoning is the worst form of capital punishment. whereas Ira Nidachat, they're killed by the sword. Now, Edim Zoamin, they could be killed in any way, depending on what they testified about. If they testified about a case of stoning like Shabbat, then they would get stoned. But the point is that they don't necessarily get stoned. They could be killed with just beheading, which is a lighter punishment. And so, unlike Avodah Zarah, which necessarily gets stoned, the other two do not necessarily get stoned. Edim Zomin lahanach tarteh ladam yasheken sirichim hatra'ah. And Edim Zomin are different from the other two because Edim Zomin do not require forewarning. We don't tell the witnesses before they testify, listen, if you testify about a capital case, then you'll get capital punishment. And they said, we know, we're doing it anyway because we don't know that they're lying at that point. We assume that they're actually doing a mitzvah by testifying, not that they're about to sin. So Edim Zomin do not require hatra'ah, whereas the other two cases require that there be forewarning. And so how can you learn one from the other? Just because they're all capital punishment, that's not sufficient because they all have different differences that are more stringent, more lenient. So the answer is beheteb, heteb, yalfinan mahadadeh. We're going to use a gezerah shava. All three have the word hetev, and so that can link them together. Ugzerah shava mufneh, ti'i la mufneh ikal mifrach. Now we have to make sure that the word hetev is extra, that it's open to use for the analogy, because if you needed the word hetev for the context, then it would not be available to use for a gezerah shava. So let's make sure that they are all available. And indeed, they are available. In fact, it is available because the Torah could have written v'dareshu v'chakeru and left out the word hetev. And instead, it doesn't say just two words for investigating. It says only one word for investigation, and it adds the word hetev. That means hetev is extra. In other words, a word doesn't have to be for a word to be available for a gezerah shava. It doesn't mean that if you erase it, you have the same thing. It's sufficient if the Torah could have used a more straightforward word. A more straightforward word would be a question word. Dareshu chakeru. Then I would know two. The fact that it doesn't say dareshu v'chakeru, instead it says hetev, so that makes it available to use for a derasha. Now this will work for the second two items. The one for an individual idolater, it just says darashta. It could have said darashta v'chakarta. Instead it says darashta hetev. So the changing it to hetev makes hetev available, and also for edim zoamin, dareshu hetev. It could have said dareshu v'chakru. Instead, it uses hetev instead of a more direct verb. So then that it means that this hetev is extra and available for use. However, this answer is not going to work well for the first one of an idolatrous city, where it already uses all the verbs. Darashta, chakarta, sha'alta. How many more words? What else is it going to say? To add some more emphasis, the only thing it could say is hetev. So this hetev is not weird. Torah could not have used any other verb, and so this hetev may not be available. And that is the next question. Ve'akate mufne misad ehadhu. Still, this is only open and available on one side. The two of them are good because they only use one verb, so then they could have used another verb, and the fact that it doesn't use another verb but uses hetev, fine. That's an extra. Mishum davar l'michtav, because it could have written the other verb. So that's fine for individual idol worship and edim zoamin. But for the first one, it already uses all the verbs, and so if you wanted to add another word of extra emphasis, so what else could it have written? Had to use hetev, so therefore that's not available in order for a gezerah shava to work. There's different opinions about this, but we're following the opinion that all the places have to have an available open word to link to the other ones. So what are you going to do about this one? No, even in the case of Ira Nidachat, it is extra because the Torah could have doubled up on one of the verbs, as it often does. Tarosh tidrosh, you shall surely investigate, you shall surely inquire, with a double verb, and I would have counted that as this is as 1 and 2, and then you have another, however many verbs there would be. And so you could have written it that way, which would have been more straightforward. And instead, the Torah uses a different word, hetev, and so now I know that this hetev also is open and available to use for a gezer hashava. Now that we found the source for requiring 7 basic questions, chakirot, in the 3 cases that we were talking about, what about other cases of capital punishment? How do you know that in those cases also we have to ask the witnesses these 7 questions? Ve'atu nechanakin b'kal v'chomer min niskalin u'min neheragin. We can learn chenek. Chenek is the lightest form of capital punishment. It goes in order. Sikila, serefa, hereg, v'chenek. So chenek, since that's the least form, so we can learn that from akal v'chomer, from sikila and hereg. Sikila, that was the punishment that we saw for the individual idolater. And hereg, the same as saif, cutting off the head, was for the idolatrous city. So since we already know that for sikila and hereg, so require these even in a severe form of capital punishment. And remember, these questions actually are helpful in getting the defendant off the hook. So if we're going to try to get him off the hook by asking all these questions in Sikila and Hereg, then all the more so, we'll try to get the Chenek guy off the hook by asking also these questions. And then Serefa, we can learn a Kavachomer from Sikila, because Sikila Serefa. So Serefa is more stringent than Hereg, therefore you cannot learn it from that, but you could still learn it from Sikila, from individual who follows idolatry. And that way, now we covered all of the types of capital punishment. Good. Now this all works if you follow Rabbanan. The majority opinion says that Sikila is the most severe. And therefore, you can learn from Sikila to Serefa and to all the others. However, there is an opinion of Rabbi Shimon. He says that Serefa is the most stringent form of capital punishment, even more than Sikila. It goes Serefa, Sikila. So then we cannot make this Kavachomer. How will I know that one has to ask these 7 questions also in Serefa? I might think Serefa is more chamor, and you know what? We're going to be more stringent and not ask the witnesses so many questions, so that there'll be less chance that they will contradict each other, and that way we will be more likely to give this form of capital punishment. Ela amar Rav Yehuda v'hinei emet nachon v'hinei emet nachon chad sereh. So Rav Yehuda has an answer. If you look in the case of the idolatrous city, it also says hinei emet nachon, and the same phrase also appears in the individual worshipper of idolatry. And if we take this phrase, emet and nachon, that means you're going to check to make sure it's truthful and it's certain. And so you have that in one case and you have it in another case. So these are 2 more plus 2 more. That's 4 more. So we already had 7 words that we saw before, and now we're adding 4 more words. Hachad sereh. Now this is 11 words that say you have to ask a lot of questions. Now we don't have 11 basic questions that we need. So what are we going to do with all these 11? Sheva lesheva chakirot. So we'll take 7 of these words and use it for the list of 7 that we already saw in the Mishnah. Dal telat gezerah shava. Now, 3 of them we're going to use for the gezerah shava. We could take the 3 hetev words, and that way it puts them all together. Earlier we said we used the hetev word for double duty, because we said, it could have used a different word, instead it uses this word. So that the fact that it uses this word instead, that makes it open, and then we use it for gezerah shava, and we also use it to count as one of them. But now we don't have to do that. Since we have 11 to work with, we don't have to do double duty. So we can say hetev is an extra word just for the gezerah shava. So that's 7 plus 3 Pasha lehu chada. There's still one extra. So now we have too many. What are we going to do with this one extra word? Oh, we actually need it. The Rabbi Shimon la tuye nisrafin. According to the Rabbi Shimon, we need an extra word to include those who deserve the capital punishment of serefa, of burning. So this extra word comes and says, yeah, also for serefa, you have to ask all these 7 questions. L'Rabbanan, and for Rabbanan, it's true, you can learn serefa from a kal v'chomer from sekila. However, there is a principle that sometimes, even if you can learn something from a kal v'chomer, the Torah goes through the bother of mentioning it explicitly. It's not exactly explicit. You have to count the words and know what to use these 3 for and those 7 for. But then you have an extra word, and so even though you're right, you could learn it from a kal v'chomer, but the extra word will come and help us out in case we didn't find it ourselves. Megadef ba Rabbi Abu. Now this answer, Rabbi Abu really didn't like it. Megadef, he cursed it or ridiculed it. This is more than just asking a question on it. He was like really offended by this. Why? Well, if you have 8, you have the 3 words for the Gezerah Shava. Okay, so leave those aside. So that's 11 minus 3, you have 8. Well, if you have 8 question words, then wouldn't that make more sense to say you need 8 questions? Why would you think you need 7 questions? Oh, plus 1 extra for something else. That doesn't to include serefa. Why would you say that? It makes a lot more sense to say 8 questions. So that's Rabbi Abahu's question. Makes sense. Now we have to clarify those questions. Is there another question that you could ask? Like what else? What did we miss? We did the day of the week, the month, the year, the Shemitah. Like what else can you possibly ask? And is there not? There is. You can ask him what time in the hour. The smallest amount we got to before was what hour. But you can ask him how many minutes, right within the hour. And so you could ask that question. So why don't we learn that from 8 words that you have to ask what time, how many minutes during the hour also. Now we're going to quote a machloket that is discussed in Masechet Pesachim about how accurate can you assume that people know time. So Abaye, within the view of explaining the view of Rabbi Meir, said a person does not make an error at all. People know exactly what the minute is. Even before watches, they had other things. They had sundials and other ways of telling time, and they can tell very accurately. And also, according to the other opinion, that says a person is off a little bit. Okay, even with a sundial, it's not going to be the exact minute, but more or less in the beginning, the middle of the hour, people can tell more or less within the hour exactly what time it is. And so that would be fine because you could ask the question. So Rabbi Abhu's question makes sense according to Abaye within the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Abaye ali bad Rabbi Yehuda damar adam toeh chasisha ulrava damar tau inashe tuba ma'ika lememad. However, according to Abaye, explaining the view of Rabbi Yehuda, who says a person is going to be off a half an hour. People can't be more exacting than within a half hour. They could tell you the first half of the hour, the second half of the hour, but not more than that. And Rava, who said that people make an error even more than that. People cannot tell within an hour at all what time it is, only from one hour to another. So then, what will you say? There is no other question to ask. And according to that, Rabbi Abhu's question, why don't you ask another question? What other question is there to ask? We could not possibly ask about the minutes within the hour because, according to these two opinions, people don't know to tell time within an hour. We can explain that his question was, you can add how many years is it in the Yovel. Now, we already said, Hainu be'ezeh shavua, we already said what Shemitah is it within the 50-year cycle. Is it the first 7 years, the second 7 years? So if you're already saying that, if you're going to tell me it's the second 7 years, the second year, well then I know, okay, that's already 7 plus 2, 9. I already know that's 9 years in the Yovel. So you can ask how many years in the Yovel, meaning the answer would be something from 1 to 50. Well, you can easily calculate that by knowing what the Shemitah is and what the year is within the Yovel. So this would be a redundant question. Oh, well, you want to know which period of 50 years is it? Did it happen, last year or 50 years before that? Because, just because you say the second year of the Yovel in the first year, well, we don't know if that's, the 8th year of this Yovel, or maybe it was the 8th year of the previous Yovel 50 years ago, or maybe it was 100 years ago. I don't know, maybe someone's coming to testify about a very old crime that he hasn't testified about. So maybe he should say which Yovel it's in. Ve'idach, okay, what's the answer to this question? Indeed, why don't we assume that the 8th question word is for just to say you have to ask 8 questions and not used for serefa? And the answer is kevan damar be'ezeh shavua la ba'eh be'ezeh yovel. No, once you tell me what shemitah it's in, what 7-year period it's in, you don't need the yovel, because no one's coming to testify 50 years later about something that happened. So there's no ambiguity in terms of which 50-year period something happened in, and there would be no need to ask that question. And therefore, there really only are 7 reasonable questions that one should ask, and therefore there's an extra word, and that extra word then would be used for serefa. Rabbi Yosef Omer. Now back to the Mishnah. Rabbi Yosef says, no, there's not 7 questions, only 3 questions. What day, what hour, and where? Tanya. Amar lehem Rabbi Yosef lachachamim li dibrechem mi sheba v'amar emesh harago. Omer lo be'ezo shavua, be'ezo shana, be'ezo chodesh, bechama b'chodesh. So we have a braita where Rabbi Yosef challenges chachamim. Says, you guys, you think you need 7 questions? According to you, what if someone comes to court and says, I witnessed that this person committed a murder yesterday. Now, if he said yesterday, are you still going to go through the whole thing and say, what Shemitah, what year, what month? What are you talking about? What year? Yesterday, right? I mean, you know what year it is. You know what month it is, right? What day of the month? All these questions seem like they would be silly if it just happened yesterday. So, you know what? There's no need to ask all these questions. So the rabbis counter and say, well, according to your logic, let's say someone comes to court and says, right now, someone committed murder. Right outside the courtyard, I was walking by, I saw someone commit murder, I walked right in, and this murder happened right now. So would we still say, what day? What do you mean? I just told you right now. Well, would you still say, what hour? What hour? Right now, right? 10 seconds ago. I just walked in. Where? Right here. So would you still ask him all these questions? So you could say the same thing. So no matter what, if according to your logic, that if it's something is so obvious, then you wouldn't ask, well then you wouldn't ask anything at all. The rabbis told Rabbi Yosef, but it's not, even you, Rabbi Yosef, would agree that although it happened immediately just now, you still ask 3 questions. So therefore, just because it happened yesterday and you know it's obvious what year, you still ask all the questions. Elaf hagav de la sarich raminan ale kedrebi Shimon ben Elazar. Hachaname afagav de la sarich raminan ale kedrebi Shimon ben Elazar. Rather, even though it's not necessary in all cases. Some cases will be necessary. Someone comes after 10 years, 15 years, and says, now I remember I have some testimony about this, or the case is open then. So then, okay, it makes sense to say what Shemitah. But not in every case will it be necessary. In most cases, don't wait so long to come to court. They're probably coming to court soon after the crime. And so, but nevertheless, even though it's not required, still, even though it's not logical that it would be, even though it's obvious what year it is and so on, still we ask the questions. Why? Because of the principle that Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar taught. He said that the dayanim, the judges who are asking questions to the witnesses, should try to confuse them. And they should jump from topic to topic and go over here and then go over there. Some say even physically move upstairs, go downstairs, or just say, what about this? And ask something from the beginning of the act and the end of the act and guess something else and ask about some detail in order to confuse the witnesses, to try to trip them up. Because if you're telling the truth, then it's easy to recall what really happened. But if you're lying, then it's a little harder to keep your story straight. So since he said that, so we can apply the same thing thing here, even though it's obvious what year it was, what Shemitah it was, still we're going to use this principle and ask him all these questions, all right, and say, oh yeah, what Shemitah? And then if he's lying, he'll might get confused and say, oh, it was the 14 years ago. So, no, I meant yesterday. If it didn't really happen, then he may answer it wrong. So that's what we're hoping for. And that's why we ask him all these questions, even though if he just came and said yesterday, it would be obvious what year it was and so on. Rabbi Yosef, doesn't he agree with this principle? Emesh harago shechiach berov eduyot. Achshav harago lo shechiach berov eduyot. Rabbi Yosef would say, no, I disagree with your analogy of these two things. You asked me that, what if he killed today? So Rabbi Yosef says, when witnesses come and say yesterday the murder happened, that happens often. Someone comes the next day or a couple of days later to testify about something. But how often does it happen that someone comes into court and says, right now, I just saw a murder right before I came into the court? That doesn't happen usually. Usually it takes time. The murder happens. We have to investigate what happened. Where were you? This, and then we set a court date and bring all the judges together. It takes at least a day to do that, and therefore the BO says in almost all cases it's going to be necessary to say what day, because if it's not today, then you have to say, well, what day? What was it? Yesterday, 2 days ago. So you have to say what day, what time, and you have to say where. So the BO saying that we follow the majority of cases that didn't happen a very long time ago. It's also unusual to come to court after a year. It's unusual to come to court the very same day. It is usual to come within a few days, and therefore these three questions are the necessary questions. So the Bia says we only ask the necessary questions, and Rabbanan says we ask even unnecessary questions because we want to try to confuse the witnesses. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.